Welcome everybody on YouTube and on the Carnegie Moscow Center website. My name is Dmitri Trenin. I'm director of the Carnegie Moscow Center and head of its Foreign and Security Policy Program. We're about to start a discussion today of the Baltic Sea security situation and ways to bolster it. Baltic Sea region, I should say. This project is supported by the Danish Embassy, Moscow, for which we're very grateful. I'm deeply privileged to introduce my guest today, Ambassador Vygaudas Ušackas, an outstanding Lithuanian statesman and European diplomat, as well as a very dear friend. Vygaudas served as the foreign minister of Lithuania, as well as Lithuania's ambassador to both the United States and the United Kingdom. He was also the European Union special representative in Afghanistan and head of the European Union delegation in Moscow. Now, Ambassador Ušackas is member of the board of directors, I should say, of the Avia Solutions Group. Not least at all, he is a very dear friend of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and particularly of its Moscow Center. We will structure today's event as follows. As a warming up, just to give you time to settle comfortably wherever you are and check your connections, I will begin with short remarks about the Baltic Sea region security seen from where I am in Russia. By the time you're ready for some serious thinking and discussion, I will give the floor to my distinguished speaker, Vygaudas Ušackas. After he is done, we will engage, him and myself, in a short discussion based on the points we both will have raised. Just to give you the time to come up with your queries, as you understand. Then the floor will be totally yours. Feel free to send your questions via YouTube or tweet us at Carnegie Russia. So let's start. 25 years ago, when I joined Carnegie, I launched my first project at the Carnegie Moscow Center. It was focused on the Baltic Sea area. As a result, after several seminars with very interesting guests, I even did a very short, thin book called The Baltic Chance, the Baltic States, Russia, and the West in the New Europe. The idea both behind the project and this thin book was to conceptualize the role of the Baltic Sea region as a laboratory for ever closer collaboration between Russia and the rest of Europe. It looked like both were integrating at that time. Well, fast forward to today. The Baltic Sea area has become the part of Europe.
Oops. Something wrong with we lost Dmitri, I understood.
Two countries, Sweden, Finland, have markedly strained. I'm talking, of course, about Russia's relations with those countries. Moscow, of course, has always considered Sweden an informal member of NATO. What is new is that Finland, Russia's direct neighbor and a neutral partner during the Cold War, is now cooperating very closely with the United States and NATO. The Baltic Sea has largely become a NATO lake. What we're witnessing is not a new Cold War, but nevertheless, it is confrontation. It's a confrontation of a new kind, which is also fraught, just like the Cold War, with high risks. The most likely danger is no longer a massive cross-border invasion or a massive nuclear attack, but an inadvertent direct collision between Russian and Western forces where they operate close to each other, or a miscalculation by one side linked to misperception about the other. While Russia-NATO confrontation itself has very deep roots and will not be resolved in the foreseeable future. Something must and can be done about bolstering military security in the Baltic Sea region. A number of reasonably non-controversial steps can be recommended, and these include reliable 24/7 communications between Russian and NATO military headquarters, from the Chief of the General Staff, or SACEUR, from that level down to the operational headquarters. A regular personal contacts between, again, the Chief of the General Staff on the Russian side and SACEUR on the NATO side, as well as national military headquarters. Incident prevention mechanisms, confidence building measures, unilateral or bilateral parallel restraint. For example, arguably the most important issue at this point from the Russian side seems to be deployment or non-deployment of nuclear and non-nuclear armed INF systems in Europe. These measures will not qualitatively change the unfortunately, adversarial relationships that exist today, and will not even start rebuilding trust between the parties, but they will reduce the likelihood of an inadvertent collision between Russia and NATO. To me, it is the inadvertent collision which is a more likely scenario of trouble, big trouble in Europe. Economic cooperation, which looked promising 25 years ago, has not lived up to those expectations. Recently, economic sanctions have become a feature of the international landscape. It's unlikely that these sanctions will be eased, let alone lifted, in the foreseeable future. The issue of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia to Germany across the Baltic Sea is an illustration of the complexities of economic relations in the energy field and the close link between geopolitics and geoeconomics. For a variety of reasons, to take a broader look at the situation, energy is losing its former role as a principal strategic backbone of relations between Russia and Western Europe. That era is drawing to a close, and there'll be no substitute for the decades-old energy relationship. At least none is in sight. Well, not much can be done about all this in the present circumstances. As I said, geoeconomics follows closely behind geopolitics. One thing that might be attempted with some hope is Russia-EU collaboration on the issue of climate and the nexus between climate and energy. Clearly, climate is very much at the top of the EU agenda today, but Russia feels the pinch of climate change, as President Putin himself has admitted, perhaps even more strongly than many other countries. At least the rise in temperature happens within the Russian territory 2.5 times faster than it does on average elsewhere in the world. The humanitarian dimension demonstrates a host of problems which are of fundamental nature, can hardly be resolved in the foreseeable future. Just look at Belarus and what the outcome of the Belarusian crisis, political crisis today, can have for Russian-Western, Russia-EU relations and for the situation in the Baltic Sea area. Belarus is quite close to the Baltic Sea region. Little can be hoped here, unfortunately, except for salvaging some cultural ties, academic and scientific exchanges, the pandemic permitting, cross-border travel and tourism. And yet, I would urge all of us not to feel resignation about this people-to-people connections. It is the connections that we have built over the decades following the end of the Cold War, including the one that's on display today between Vygaudas and myself, that can be instrumental in building a future that will be better than the present. Certainly, this situation is unsatisfactory, whether looking from Moscow or from the Baltic Sea region capitals. Looking ahead, it's important to set our sights on something more secure, more productive, and more positive. While doing that, it's also important to be realistic. Of course, we don't know what will happen in the next decade, and a lot will happen, both within our countries and between our countries. Given these precepts, one could consciously start repairing the badly broken relationship on a common basis of neighborliness. I would stress that concept, neighborliness. This falls short of partnership that we attempted and failed to build, but it would end unchecked hostility, which is spreading. Russia and its Baltic Sea neighbors, starting with the Baltic states closer to Moscow and St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad, will continue to disagree, while we continue to disagree bitterly about many things. We need to seek to manage the conflicts that we're involved in and disagreements of which we are on opposite sides in order to prevent war that neither side wants or needs. So I think war prevention comes at the very top of the list. Desist from provoking one's neighbors. Give those neighbors a modicum of respect, no matter how grudging. Find niches, however small, for productive dialogue and even cooperation, including such issues as environment protection, climate change, the Arctic, and the like. So let me stop here. The warming up period is over. And now the main dish, the main speaker today, Vygaudas Ušackas. Vygaudas, the floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Dmitri. It's a great pleasure to be back with you, albeit through video conferencing. That's a new normal, new reality we're facing, and I'm particularly pleased to join such a distinguished and talented team of the Carnegie Moscow Center, as well as the Danish embassy in Moscow, since being myself a graduate of Aarhus University in Stanskis. As Dmitri, I will start with romantic memories from 1990s. On November 19th, 1996, as a Deputy Foreign Minister of Lithuania, I was delivering a keynote speech over the Baltic's course to join NATO at the conference in Stockholm, which was organized by the American Embassy in Sweden and the Swedish Institute for International Relations. Among a number of arguments, I also stressed Lithuania's membership in NATO should be considered as a powerful way, a potential way of buttressing relations with Russia. I argued that, that's a quotation from that speech, although memories of recent occupation are still alive, becoming part of the alliance and thus gaining recognition that our nation is an inalienable part of the Western democracies, Lithuania could further pursue an open and mutually beneficial economic partnership with Russia, and such a relationship is equally in the interest of Russia itself. What is also astonishing from today's event, and not only perspective, that in this first, probably most comprehensive speech by the Lithuanian senior government official regarding NATO membership plea, I also quoted, and guess whom? Another keynote speaker, Dmitri Trenin, and his assertion from the article, Russia and NATO, Road to the Future. He said in that article, I think back in 1996, that, and I quote, independently of what kind of relationship develops between Russia and NATO, it will continue to be the cornerstone of any European security regime. Voila. And here we are 26 years after. It is already 16 years since Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have joined the mightiest alliance in history, NATO, and have become members of the richest economies in the world, European Union. Economically, we are an integral part of the Nordic economic and financial sub-region of the European Union, immediately neighboring Russia, a vast land of challenges, risks, and great opportunities. While COVID-19 pandemic has pushed forward the importance of health security and health diplomacy worldwide, today's security equation in the Baltic Sea region remain primarily considered against Russia's internal and external developments. Russia's hybrid warfare, illegal annexation of Crimea, and war in eastern Ukraine remain primary preoccupations for the Baltic states. Developments in Belarus, to which Dmitry has alluded, and uncertainty over future of Russian-Belarusian alliance constitute yet another geopolitical puzzle for Baltics, Poland, and the European Union at large. With support of NATO and its member states, we the Baltic states, and especially Lithuania, has been managing to address the most acute external security defense vulnerability, so-called Suwalki corridor. Since 2016, NATO began temporary rotation of 4 multinational mechanized battalions of 4,500 personnel to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Hence, the so-called tripwire concept of enhanced forward presence demonstrates credible capability and resolve within NATO to defend the Baltic states and sends a strong message of deterrence. The Baltic states enjoy alliance member states' rotational support in conducting air police missions. Lithuanian government in particular has been advocating for some time that relevant procedures and mechanisms have to be set in advance in order to ensure the smooth transition of NATO air policing mission to air defense mission in crisis. This would certainly significantly enhance NATO's deterrence effect in the region. The Baltic nations have also shown a remarkable resilience in response to cyber attacks and info warfare. Journalists, private citizens, and state authorities have helped to expose over 900 cases of misleading information on COVID-19 spread in multiple languages alone since January 28 this year. Hence, on the one hand, in the overall, the Baltic states can be concluded have successfully solidified its integration into the West, gained NATO's and European Union support, and presence on the ground. We should, however, be cognizant as the Baltics to talk to our neighbors. Russia is the biggest neighbor next to us. And we should talk on the issues where our interests coincide in order to avoid unintended military incidents, which due to a lack of communication and or absence of basic mil-to-mil contact may lead to a real military confrontation. In this regard, dialogue over military risk reduction is important, not only with Russia, but also with Belarus, with whom we have a longest external border, and Minsk is the closest capital, external capital of Lithuania. As you know, discussions have intensified in various think tank and expert forums about the revitalization and application of confidence-building measures. The following possible measures could contribute to reduce tensions and avoid misinterpretation in the Baltic region. First, full and unrestricted implementation of already agreed commitments enshrined in the Vienna document and Open Skies agreement. Secondly, additional voluntary restraint and transparency measures, such as exchange of information on size and scope of military in contagious areas with scope wider and thresholds for advanced notification and mandatory observation lower than those required under the 2011 Vienna CSBM document. Another mean could be reopening and use of the hotlines between commanders on the contact line. A comprehensive menu of possible CSBMs were outlined in recommendations of the participants of the expert dialogue on NATO-Russia military risk reduction in Europe, which were posted on the European Leadership Network website this Monday. This is worth of reviewing. In my previous life as diplomat and politician, I devoted considerable time to support and facilitate cross-border cooperation with Kaliningrad Oblast as critically important soft security engagement to maintain people-to-people contact, implementation of environmental projects, and educational exchanges with our immediate neighbors. I hope that the currently newly developed multi-annual program of the EU vis-a-vis Russia will include cross-border cooperation projects as a way forward in maintaining and enhancing cross-border cooperation. Distrust, sense of insecurity, and clash of the worldviews remain deeply implanted in minds of policymakers, both in the Baltics and in Russia. As Dmitri said, we're witnessing a new kind of confrontation, which is also fraught with high risks. The real question is, who will be the first to blink in a positive way by showing a political will to really talk on some issues Dmitri and I have mentioned. Today, to date, and for some time to come, the Baltic governments will continue to pursue first sanctions policy towards Russia. I do see neither political appetite nor justified reason in the Baltic states or by the Baltic states to be ready to depart from this policy unless tangible progress over Ukraine is achieved. Recently, President Putin's expressed readiness to cooperate with Lithuania on the basis of good neighborhood and mutual respect was received and considered in Vilnius as a pure public relations statement. Realistically, practical mill-to-mill dialogue should first be reestablished at the NATO-Russia level. This would contribute towards creating an enabling and more conducive political environment for some sort of governmental dialogue and application of considered confidence-building measures in the Baltic Sea region as an integral part of the overall NATO-Russia relations. In the meantime, discussion among experts and think tank community of the Baltic Sea region, a kind of second-track path of the Baltic Sea state representatives, like today, may contribute to better understand concerns, appreciate limitations, but also help to find out the ways and means how to avoid conflict and manage adversity between Russia and its Western, immediate, and northern neighbors. I hope this discussion will help us to bring that awareness and the way forward. Thank you.
Well, Vygaudas, thank you very much for this tour d'horizon. That's very comprehensive, that's very candid, and that's a great basis for discussion. Before we are joined by those who are watching us and listening to us, let me ask you a question. You were among 16 former foreign and defense ministers out of 145 signatories to an interesting document that was published 2 days ago, calling for revitalization, or I would say resurrection, of what you call mill-to-mill dialogue between Russia and NATO, precisely on the issues that you have mentioned. And I've mentioned some of them in my own remarks. So my question is, actually I have two questions. What kind of an impact do you think this kind of an appeal is likely to have on the governments in NATO countries, particularly in European countries? That's one. And then, as one of the signatories of that document, what do you think should be the next steps? You've been in government, you've been in the European Union, you've been with NATO, so you know how these things work from that perspective. So what would you expect as an outcome of that, in my view, very sane, eminently serious, hard-nosed appeal to sanity, to bolster security in the Baltic Sea region, or I would say reduce the insecurity that exists there? So what would you say to that?
Well, thank you, Dmitri. Let me, if you allow me, first very brief introduction so that the audience and the readers would appreciate what this document is about and what is not about. This document is not about a call for NATO's no business as usual policy to be reviewed. It's not about vis-a-vis Russia. It's not about, suggesting yet another reset policy, because people who were involved in this work for 15 sessions every Thursday night for 4 hours, the former government officials, ministers, the defense, foreign affairs, intelligence services. We're all very realistic and blunt in terms of understanding that we will not resolve those political confrontations and the clash of the worldview which exists between Russian leadership and the West at this stage. But this document is about how can we walk the fine line without provoking or without being provoked into the accidents or incidents with a military confrontation in a military confrontation way, which would have a colossal consequences. So that's why this document, I mean, again, it's a set of the menus of good practices and ideas, which was forwarded to NATO and the EU leadership, as well as to Russian leadership. It is not the only one document of similar nature. I know that within NATO itself, there is a work taking place of dedicated experts. But I mean, bearing in mind, my experience in decision-making process, and I know I've sent myself, to the leadership of the EU and the number of ambassadors concerned in particular countries, and I received a very positive response in terms of appreciation of interesting ideas. But everyone is wondering, to an extent, what I have mentioned, who's going to be first to blink, because there's no political will at this stage, neither from Russian side nor from NATO side, to enter into a meaningful, constructive conversation. I think, it's not that, the change of administration in the United States will have an impact, but it may have an impact, because with every administration in the United States, there is a review of the policies, and I would expect that Blinken's security team will remain even more engaged and more demanding with respect of democracy, with respect to compliance to the rule of law and individual freedoms. But at the same time, in the tradition of mature diplomacy and responsible political way of conducting the business, I would expect there will be an interest expressed to address issues such as, how to extend the New START treaty for another 5 years. What will happen? What should be done with the United States exit from the Open Sky Agreement, and what military confidence building measures can be applied? So in that respect, I think first of all the ideas have to settle. That informed discussion will certainly be taking place among the allies, and I would assume within the Russian administration. And then, I think there is the need for further awareness building, so that there is a achieved political understanding and political will to start a conversation. I think, the first thing is about, that there must be a contact and a conversation taking place either between Washington, D.C. and Moscow, or between NATO and Russia.
Well, thank you very much. Given what you've said about extension of the New START and the U.S. return to the Open Skies Treaty, you would expect Tony Blinken to be the first to blink positively, as his name suggests. And if that happens, I'm sure there will be a blink on the other side, which I think broadly, my feeling is that broadly what has been suggested in that initiative, actually the push came from the side of Russian academic institutions, the US-Canada Institute and the Institute of Europe, both under the Russian Academy of Sciences. So I very much hope that this has some traction. Now, do you have questions on what I've said? Would you? Otherwise, we will throw the floor open to the public. But if
I do have, Dmitri. I'm sorry. I would be very much interested that you would share your brief, at least, account on where Russia stands when it comes to the Baltic region. I quoted President Putin's remarks, which he made on the occasion of reception of credentials from the new Lithuanian ambassador in the Kremlin, where President Putin expressed his readiness on the mutually respective constructive relations with Lithuania, which I think is applied for all three Baltic states. To what extent that statement has a beef behind the words, and what would that entail in terms of the content?
Well, I think that, I was asked that question by a Lithuanian journalist right after it was made. And my response was that I took out a magnifying glass, the biggest I had, and looked at the statement word for word, letter by letter. And I found that it was a polite statement, as a nation's leader would give to a newly appointed ambassador at the time when the ambassador gives his credentials to the head of the state. There's nothing in that statement other than we're neighbors and we need to have decent relations. And I think that was basically the message. Nothing beyond that. Certainly, it's a good thing that, frankly, it's a good thing that it was a polite message. It could have been a different message, because Moscow is not happy with some of the noise that hears from Vilnius. It's not happy with Vilnius hosting a few people who are highly critical of the Russian government and all that. So it's a good thing that the message was polite, and the call was for a decent relationship. But your broader question, I think that the Baltic states are virtually absent from the Russian diplomatic map. It's a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing that, there are some things that Russia objects to vehemently in several Baltic countries. I mentioned your country, but there's things that Russia is unhappy about in Latvia and Estonia. But it's more about jabs in the media, or jabs on the, call it propaganda front, or call it information warfare front. The good thing is that at the bilateral state-to-state level, there's a lot of disagreement, but there are no running conflicts. And that's a good thing. And I haven't heard, for example, any complaints about the Lithuanian transit, Kaliningrad to Russia via Belarus and Lithuania. This is a good thing. So at minimum, I think the task should be to start decent neighborly dialogue. Even when you're not looking for a breakthrough, but at least you come and you establish a personal relationship with the people on the other side. It's always good to see especially your adversaries, as human beings. I was present at the Estonian embassy recently, just before the pandemic, on the Estonian president's trip to Moscow, a very rare trip. It was even a sort of a semi-private, if you like. It was not a state visit. She came to unveil the renovated and very nice Estonian embassy in central Moscow. But then she made a call at President Putin's office, and she was received by the president. They had a discussion, which I think was decent. And although she was criticized, I understand, in her own country for making that trip, that established a relationship. I think we're at a very low level, the Baltic states and Russia. At that level, the first step needs to be, let's start talking. Let's meet even, and not talk across boundaries, but talk across the table when it becomes possible, and start having a dialogue on the issues that are of practical importance, even though they may, as I said, they may not promise much in terms of a breakthrough. But there are things, as I mentioned, Kaliningrad, there are certainly things that Russia and Lithuania need to discuss with regard to Kaliningrad. There are other things, economic, humanitarian, and others, and that need to be a subject of conversation. I think much more needs to be done at the unofficial, informal level. We talked a lot about history in this year of the 75th anniversary of victory over Nazism. And I think that the divergent views, official views of history, are cause for concern. And I remember a decade ago, Poland and Russia engaged in a dialogue among historians, professional historians, on mutual Russian-Polish history, which is laden, I think, with more conflict and more adversity than Baltic-Russian relations. Even combined, all the three Baltic states would be relations would be less adverse than the Russian-Polish one. But the interesting thing was that it was on the Polish side. This was led by former Foreign Minister Adam Rotfeld, whom you and I know very well. Yeah. And Adam said when he held up a joint volume of Polish and Russian historians, he said, I challenge you. I will just hide the names of the authors, and you will not be able to tell whether this chapter was written by a Pole or by a Russian. That's the level that we achieved a decade ago through an attempted and unfortunately aborted historical reconciliation with Poland. And you would recall that the Patriarch of Russia was, to use your terminology, was the first to blink, the first ever visit by the Russian Orthodox Patriarch to Krakow, to Krakow, to Warsaw. And that, unfortunately, as I said, this process was aborted. But that's the way to go. We will need to revisit those places. So that would be my long answer to your very short and very concise question. Well, in the interest of our audience, let's deal with the questions that are already coming. And let me give you a question. I think it's that I received from the audience. What, in a way, this is a continuation of the discussion that you have just started. In your view, where can Russia and the Baltic states productively cooperate? From your perspective in Vilnius, where are those areas where we can collaborate? And mind you, everyone, we're talking about the Baltic Sea region, which is bigger than Kaliningrad, St. Petersburg, and the three Baltic states. It also includes the Nordic countries, and includes Poland, and includes Germany. So what would you say? What are, in your view, what are the points of collaboration where some result can be expected?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remind ourselves that, I mean, not all the bridges have been burned in the course of last, well, gosh, since just 67 years, since Crimea and Ukraine conflict. And, I vividly remember being as the EU ambassador and traveling to Pskov, to St. Petersburg, to Kaliningrad, and receiving most welcome in those centers of the oblast, and the interest which has been expressed and concrete projects implemented have demonstrated our common work in environment, in student exchanges, as well as in cross-border cooperation. So, I mean, Kaliningrad is unavoidably the major interest for Lithuania as immediate Russian part of the Baltic Sea, as it is Pskov, Novgorod, and St. Petersburg for Latvia, Estonia, as well as for Finland and other Baltic Sea states. I think that's the most natural area where we should retain our contacts and cooperation, and that, in fact, the work is ongoing at the level of local governments and special agencies. With respect to the political dialogue, I remember years, I mean, in 10, 15 years, we used to have, 8+1, 5+3 Nordic Baltic foreign ministers or deputy ministers would meet with a Russian foreign minister or deputy ministers in the format of the Council of the Baltic Sea States. Those political discussions have been put on hold at this stage, but I mean, at some stage, I mean, they may be revoked. Having said this, realistically, Dmitry, from my point of view, and bearing in mind such a divergence and clash over the conflicts in Ukraine and different views vis-a-vis Belarus, I think it is more realistic to reconnect, as what you and the Danish embassy in Moscow is trying to do, to reconnect the expert community, think tank community. You know, if I look to the, last 7 years, I don't think we as Lithuania even had a roundtable discussion with the Russian counterparts, except the one I hosted myself, and you, Dmitry, could not come, about 3 years ago on cooperation with Kaliningrad. Otherwise, that dialogue is absent. Although I reckon that there is a number of Lithuanian think tank community, and we have a new generation of political scientists, researchers who are specializing in Russia, but have never been in Russia, whose skills in Russian language are very modest, if at all. And empirical knowledge and empirical contacts with the counterparts in Russia are, if not nil, then very, very limited. And here I would certainly invite to continue the work of what you've started to do with the Danish embassy, and I would invite the Baltic counterparts to chip in and to organize a similar event. I mean, be it in the Zoom or when things will calm down, also in terms of with the physical presence. I think that would be desirable. The question is whether one should start from the bilateral conversation or to go on the regional level. I would probably start on the bilateral roundtable discussion between the expert community, and then we can push up to the regional level. And because at this stage, as I said, we don't see anyone blinking, and we don't see a political courage or political will to start a conversation, because those heavyweight issues are still dominating the agenda. Last but not least, what I would also express the hope that, Belarus, from my point of view, might be one of the building blocks of a new conversation between Russia and, I would say, the entire European Union, where the Baltics and Poland can participate. We see how heavily dependent Alexander Lukashenko is on Moscow's on Moscow, but at the same time, if we want to see a gradual de-escalation of situation and movement into the transfer into a stage of both new constitution, as what Lukashenko himself pledged, and the Russian leadership supported, and new elections. It would be very appropriate and understandable that appropriate OC and EU institutions would be involved to observe as inclusive dialogue and also transparent elections in the future.
Well, I think, Vygaudas, you also managed to respond to one question that we got on Twitter about the situation in Belarus and its impact on the Baltic-Russian relations. Let me take one question that we got from Janet Gunn. In 2001, when the NATO-Russia Council was announced, some were surprised that Russia would have equal status to a small country like Lithuania. Does Russia now accept Lithuania as an equal partner? Look, in international relations, you accept formally, you accept any country in the world as your equal. That's That's the United Nations standard. One country, one vote at the UN Security, at the UN General Assembly. On the other hand, we're all very unequal in so many ways. A lot of Russians chafe when somebody calls them a regional power. So it's all, and this will never end. But the important thing is not between Russia and Lithuania is not equality in international weight or whatever. It is equal partnership. If it's partnership, I think that the important thing is partnership. And I don't think that partnership is something that's round the corner. I think that we should not set our sights too high. We're talking about neighborliness and neighborly relationship. And if you have a good neighborly relationship, then you respect your partner, or your neighbor, and you build relations with that neighbor accordingly. And this is what Vygaudas and myself, I think, have been talking about. There's a question which I think I will address to you, Vygaudas, from Vadim Makarenko. Perhaps we should take Barry Buzan's concept of securitization to explain this aggressiveness by the internal interests of the ruling groups in the countries concerned. What would you make of that?
Well, I don't think we can just simplify the current intransigency in terms of the policies vis-a-vis Russia, because it's not that securitization of certain interest groups define or redefine the policies. One should understand that the Baltic states have reacted in a way they reacted both vis-a-vis violation of territorial integrity in Ukraine and then events in Belarus. Through the emotional way and political way, because as I alluded in my remarks, reminding my speech back in 1996, the history still has an impact. History has an impact in Russia, and history has a very strong impact in the mindset and the political considerations of the Baltic states. So whenever a neighbor who has once occupied the Baltic states have done it, with illegal annexation of another neighbor, it has a tremendous impact. And it's not that some interest groups would, orchestrate the shift of the policy. It was a very natural, emotional reaction of the population at large, and politicians have followed that reaction. Having said this, I think politicians also have a role to play in terms of in shaping the future. There are things which you can change, there are things which you cannot change, quoting from the Bible, and God has to enlighten us to figure out the distinction between the two. And some things will not change anytime soon, but we will remain as neighbors. And if you look back to the EU policy, because we as the Baltic countries and Denmark and Sweden and Finland as well, we are part of the common foreign security framework of the European Union, which clearly states 5 principles of EU towards Russia. It's application of sanctions, it's support for Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and others, but also it spells out our openness to talk on the issues of common interest. And and that's where I think we have to figure out. Understanding that there are common interests of neighborhood which we should to talk. But again, in the absence of political dialogue at the higher levels, I think the think tank community, expert community, should be the first one to help to create that more informed and conducive environment.
Right. I have a question that we got from YouTube. Actually, it's to both of us. I'll answer, or I'll take part of it, and you will take the other. Why would Russia invade the Baltic states? What is there in the Baltics that Russia needs? I don't think that this question is on the Russian leadership's mind. I think this is simply irrelevant in today's situation. I understand that there are feelings, and Vygaudas talked about that, and I understand that there are historical memories, and they run very long, but I see nothing, absolutely, for Russia to gain or for Russia to want in the Baltic states that would require an attack. The other part of that same question is directed at you, I think, Vygaudas. Are the Baltic states using Russia to stay relevant? What would you say to that?
Well, you know, I would quote, I mean, the former president of Estonia, Thomas Ilves, when he was asked, I mean, is Estonia a Nordic or Baltic country? He said, well, we would love to be a boring Nordic country which would not have problems with no one. So yeah. I would subscribe to his proposition, but things are different. I mean, as I said in my initial remarks, Russia is a vast land and country of talented people and you know, and with huge opportunities, but also challenges and risks. And with all due respect, what Dmitri said, I you know, in the course of my 5 years working in Moscow, in my conversations with President Putin, with Foreign Minister Lavrov, with generals from General Staff and other politicians, except probably Zhirinovsky. No one else had threatened Lithuania to take over tanks or by tanks or any other means. I think, I mean, and Dmitry, you probably agree with that Russian leadership has accepted the notion that the Baltics are part of the West. We are part of NATO and the European Union, and any adventurism and opportunism would certainly have very serious repercussions, I mean, for the region, but also for Russia. So, of course, I mean, each defense staff has contingency plans and has different, you know, scenarios for whatever military activities may happen. But I don't think there is a political will or political consideration to attack the Baltic states, since they are now enshrined as a full-fledged members. But at the same time, you know, of course, I mean, the developments which are taking place around, I mean, the influence, and that's why on our part, on the Baltic part, we are investing in defense. We're investing in attracting a greater presence of NATO and United States military in particular. But that has to be also accompanied from my professional belief and experience, also by conversation, by talking to your neighbors, even if you may not like each other, but your neighbors, and that's important to avoid unintended severe consequences, especially in the military field.
Excellent. There's one question that I think I will have to take. Will the Baltic states in future face from Russia the consequences similar to Georgia for being close to NATO? Well, they're not, as Vygaudas has explained, they're not close to NATO. They are NATO. They have been NATO for 16 years. And mind you, the entry into NATO was not preceded by any conflict with Russia. Now, you have to study the situation between Russia and Georgia and within Georgia, and between Georgia and Abkhazia, Georgia and South Ossetia, both after the end of the Soviet Union, to understand the complexities of that situation. And of course, that was part of the, you also need to add to that the situation that was connected with NATO enlargement. It's very different situations, and what happened with and in Georgia, I don't think has relevance to the relations between Russia and the Baltic states. I don't think that drawing parallels would be very helpful. But the most important thing, again, they are in NATO. It's already a fact. Maybe we still have a couple of minutes, barely a couple of minutes. Let me ask you perhaps the last question. Did apparent U.S. unilateralism tendencies and colder attitude, meaning I think the Trump administration's attitude toward NATO, increase security risks for the Baltic states? That would be, if you could just wrap it in 1 minute or half a minute, your answer to that question, then I'll have time for the second question.
Well, while America's first policy of Trump was really a subject of concern, not only for the Baltics but for Europeans, I would argue that for different reasons, not of probably President Trump's his own, will, but we have obtained even greater support and presence of the United States in the Baltic states and Poland than ever before in the history. So in that respect, and especially with the new administration coming, with very mature and experienced people surrounding President-elect Joe Biden, we expect continuous support and appreciation from United States leadership vis-a-vis NATO and European Union in particular.
Thank you very much. Another question from the same person, and I will respond to it. Marius Petrushonis, I think that's the name.
That's our diplomat in Washington, D.C.
Oh, great! Oh, great! Good. So
actually,
you answered his question. I didn't wonder, but you answered his first question. I'll answer the second one from him. On several occasions, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service chief Sergei Naryshkin said that the U.S. is training fighters in neighboring nations and sending them into Belarus to support anti-Lukashenko protests. Is this a justification for a possible action in response? I don't see it as a pretext for any military action against by Russia against the countries that may have been implicated in that statement. Let me say it very directly and clearly. I do not see Russia itching to start a war, because we're talking military action, to start a war against a NATO country. Whatever the other things, whatever action other things can provoke on the Russian side. And very lastly, I think this is a question for me: is the deployment of nuclear weapons to Kaliningrad a threat to the Baltic Sea region's security, or should this be seen in a wider European or even transatlantic context? Well, Kaliningrad, as we all know, is part and parcel of Russia, and there are no restrictions with regard to Russia deploying whatever weapons it wishes to deploy in any part of its territory now that the CF3 treaty is essentially defunct. But there is an issue with regard to nuclear weapons in Europe, US weapons in various European countries. But even the bigger issue, as far as I'm concerned, is the tendency to lower the threshold for nuclear use. And I think this is evident if you look closely at the nuclear doctrines today. And that means that in today's world, where war unfortunately has become thinkable. When I was a military officer in the 80s, deployed in East Germany, 70s and 80s, deployed in East Germany, any war to us looked like a world war, which essentially made that kind of war pretty unlikely. Any war. was considered, any war between Russia and the United States was considered to be unlikely because of the huge cost of the abolition of mankind that war appeared to bring with it. Nowadays, when that threat is somehow out of people's minds, people have come up with all sorts of ideas of how to win war, how to use military power to a political advantage, and how to defeat the other guy. And I think this is dangerous. People are engaged in thinking and discussing and laying down plans for military action that would bring their countries to victories against a nuclear power. Now, in my judgment, no nuclear power is likely to accept conventional defeat at the hands of another nuclear power. So there will be a huge pressure for going nuclear at some point. And once you go nuclear, you don't know where you stop. So I'm less concerned with weapons per se. I'm more concerned with the thinking behind the weapons and the doctrines. And in this climate of growing adversity and hostility between Russia on the one hand and the West on the other hand, the things that we considered unthinkable are becoming very thinkable. And this is a warning to all of us to be a little bit careful and build guardrails around the new threat that has emerged in Europe. So our time, unfortunately, is up. And very unfortunately, I have to apologize. I haven't been able to respond to all the questions or give those questions to my esteemed guest, Vygaudas Ušackas. So we, both of us, apologize for not being able to take all the questions, but we're very thankful, grateful for those who took the time to watch this live dialogue and to invest a bit of their time in thinking about potentially improving the very unsatisfactory set of relations in the Baltic Sea area, and in particular, I would say, between the Baltic states and the Russian Federation. Thank you all. Vygaudas, if you want to say something, please do. No, this is your last chance.
No, I think you did so brilliantly that I need just to thank you, Dmitri, and your team and the Danish Embassy in Moscow for organizing this forum. And I thank audience for your questions. I mean, since we didn't reply to everyone, I think that's a good excuse to continue in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Now, everyone, stay well, be healthy.